I'm Alan Greeley, and I love thinking and meditating on Scripture. Another word for it, which we don't use very often, is pondering. When the mother of Jesus heard the shepherds retell the vision of the angels' celebratory singing, the Scripture says Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. That alone is my goal with this podcast. I want us to treasure in our hearts what we hear from God and ponder it. It would be an honor to have you listen in and ponder with me. To God be the glory.
You have been so good to me.
Ponder the solstice with me. If you haven't noticed, and I'm sure you have, it's been very dark of late. There's not a lot of sunshine throughout the day. The word solstice refers to the points at which the sun has reached its maximum in sunlight or its minimum. Or to put it in plainer language, the longest day or the shortest day of the year. The summer solstice for 2024 was June 20th. That was the longest day of the year as far as sunlight goes. And the shortest day of the year is just around the corner. It's about 10 days from now. December 21st will be the shortest day of sunlight this calendar year. And I'm sure you've noticed this just like I have. I've been dropping my oldest son off at school, and lately it's been dark outside when I drop him off. He has wrestling practice right now from 3 to 5, and so I go to pick him up a little after 5, and by the time we get home, the sun is basically gone. So I'm dropping him off in the dark. We're getting home in the dark, and it's just kind of caught my attention recently. The days are really pretty short as far as sunlight is concerned. And for the next 10 days, they'll get slightly shorter even. And then we'll have the shortest day of the year on the 21st, as I mentioned, and slowly but surely from December 22nd going forward, the sun will be shining longer and longer. So the days have been pretty dark of late from a physical perspective. I hope they have not been dark for you spiritually or emotionally, but we've had some dark days physically of late. And all the driving in the morning darkness and the evening darkness has made me think about some scriptures that refer to Christ as the dawn or as the morning star. Jesus calls himself this very thing in Revelation 22, verse 16, where Jesus says, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. That statement from Jesus is in the last few sentences of the book of Revelation. Jesus is closing the book and telling John, I, Jesus, sent my angel to tell you all of these things for the benefit of the churches. And then I find this interesting, that Jesus tells John and tells the churches who he is, and he does so with Old Testament language. That's common in the New Testament. Now, obviously, though, John knows who Jesus is. John is an apostle. John spent years with Jesus, and he spent decades preaching and teaching by the time Revelation is written. And also the churches know who Jesus is. We know he's the Son of God. That's what the church is built on. So what I'm asking is, if John knows Jesus and the churches know who Jesus is, why is it important for Jesus to use this Old Testament language to say who he is at the end of the book? The two ways that he describes himself again are these. I'm the root and the descendant of David. I am the bright morning star. The descendant of David language goes back to God's promise to David in 2 Samuel 7 that he would have a son that would reign forever. Also, this language ties into many psalms like Psalm 89. The language about the root of David also ties into prophecies like the stump of Jesse from Isaiah chapter 11. Jesse was David's father, so we're talking about the same family there. In other words, Jesus is carefully identifying himself with the promised Messiah in passages like 2 Samuel 7, Psalm 89, Isaiah chapter 11. And those passages and this language of Jesus being David's son, we are probably more familiar with than the next one, which is the bright morning star. Jesus, at the close of the book, written to people who know who he is already, to John and the churches, Jesus wants to identify himself one more time, and he does so as the bright morning star. Now, what is this all about? There's a cool connection that we're not going to look at, but there's a cool connection that I want to at least mention in case you want to dig into it and study for it yourself, is Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24. But the passage that I'd like to think about with you on this podcast is Isaiah 60. The bright morning star is just a fancy way of talking about the sun. There's no star brighter than the sun, and there's no star associated with morning like the sun. Okay, that makes sense. There's no star brighter than the sun. There's no star associated with morning like the sun. The bright morning star is a figurative way of talking about the sun and the sunrise. And when you watch a sunrise, just picture one in your mind with me. The sun literally looks like that's what it's doing, rising. You can see a little bit of the top of the sun at the sunrise, just the sliver, hanging above the earth. And then a little bit later on, you can see half of it hanging above the earth. And then slowly but surely, you can see the whole sun. And then throughout that morning, it's rising. It's getting higher. It's rising higher and higher. Well, the reason I mention this is because in Isaiah 60, the text is going to mention the glory of the Lord, the light, the brightness is rising. And it's rising on God's people. Here's the passage. It's Isaiah 60. The first 3 verses read this way. Arise, shine. It's like God is speaking to the sun itself. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you, and nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. And in case you missed hearing all of them, the idea of arising or rising light comes up 4 times in those short 3 verses. Verse 1 mentioned, arise, shine, your light has come. Sounds like a sunrise, doesn't it? Verse 2 mentions the glory of the Lord has arisen. I know many of you know this already, but I think it's worth mentioning. The glory of the Lord is always depicted in the Old Testament as light. So the glory of the light of the Lord has arisen. Sounds like a sunrise, doesn't it? Then verse 3 speaks of the Lord himself arising upon the people. So it's this rising light, it's the rising glory, and now it's the rising Lord himself. And then verse 4 talks about the people living in darkness, seeing this light, being attracted to it. Think of people being attracted to the gospel, people living in sin, living in darkness, being attracted to the brightness of your rising, the text says. Again, 4 times within 3 verses, the idea is the rising light of God, the rising light of God going to shine on God's people, and it's associated with dispelling darkness, and how some in the darkness will actually be attracted to come to the light. So why is Jesus, at the close of Revelation, reminding his followers that he's the bright morning star, rising morning light? Well, there's so many things that we could say. We could list off a half a dozen, I'm sure. But I'm just going to give you one for this podcast. I know there are others. Consider just this one, though, with me. For the believer, no matter how dark it gets, Jesus is going to burst through all of that in the light of his glory. Well, what does that mean, Alan? Well, through the gospel, Jesus is constantly calling people out of darkness, just like Isaiah 60 predicted, that there would be some in darkness that are attracted to this rising light. We need to be ready to help these people find the light of the world, Jesus the Christ. But how else is Jesus going to burst through the darkness in the light of his glory? There's a hymn called Christ Returneth. I know many of you are familiar with it and have sung it throughout your life. Verse 2 of that song says this: it may be at midday, it may be at twilight, it may be perchance that the blackness of midnight will burst into light in the blaze of his glory when Jesus receives his own. And I think Jesus, at least in part, is referring to his second coming when he refers to himself as the bright morning star. He does that in chapter 22, verse 16 of Revelation, and it's just a few sentences later. Guess what he's promising just a few sentences later? I'm coming back. I'm coming back. In other words, there's going to be a sunrise like we've never witnessed before. Here's the point. What these churches needed to hear in the first century, and what any Christian needs to hear, about all the wickedness in the world, all the oppression, all the disbelief, all the persecution, all the lack of faith out there, no matter how dark the world gets, no matter how steeped in the dark our societies and our nation gets, Jesus can and will burst through it all in the blaze of his glorious return. The Christians in the first century needed to hear that, and so do we. I realize we are not physically oppressed like they were in the first century, but I would put our distractions up against anyone's. We may not be physically oppressed like they were, but we have distractions galore. And perhaps what we need to do to center ourselves in the midst of all these distractions is to remind us about this sunrise. So there's been some physically dark days recently. The darkest day is just around the corner, the winter solstice, December 21st this year. But the following day, on the 22nd, it's going to get lighter and lighter and lighter. And in that, I see a metaphor. As dark as it gets spiritually, it is nothing Jesus can't or won't break through, because he is the bright morning star.
There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found something to treasure in your hearts and ponder. The song you've heard is Reckless Love, sung by Praise and Harmony on their album, Resurrecting God. May God's face shine on you always.
Love of God, oh.